Welcome to CP Newsroom. I'm Morgan Lee. Today we'll be talking about millennials and their relationship with organized religion. To have this conversation, I'm joined by Naomi Schaefer Riley, who's the author of Got Religion, a book which discusses these topics exactly. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
I think it's helpful for us just to back up and look at the millennial generation as a whole and to kind of like contextualize them within the context of American history. And so how are they unique with regards to organized religion from other generations that we've seen?
Well, your viewers may be familiar with this famous Pew poll that came out a couple of years ago that showed that 30% of Americans under 30 register no religious affiliation. They're called nuns, N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S. Basically, this sort of caused a huge amount of panic, I think, among a lot of religious communities. And in some cases, I think, there's cause for concern. I think the way that this generation is different from previous generations is that they are taking longer to get married. Now, marriage was typically the time historically when people would come back to church or synagogue or mosque. It would be the time that they would think, oh, I need to settle down, I need to find somebody to marry me and my husband or wife, I need to find a place for the kids to go to Hebrew school or, get baptized or something like that. So now what we have is this historically unprecedented rise in the age of first marriage. It's now at 27 for women, 29 for men, and that gets even higher if you are college educated. So what's happening is people are spending more than a decade, in some cases, away from organized religion. It's what sociologists refer to as emerging adulthood. And so they're sort of jumping around, they're moving to different cities, taking different jobs, different roommates, and they're not really attaching themselves to institutions. Now, some of them do come back. However, being away from something for 10 years, you sort of lose the habit. And I think that is something that we really need to pay attention to.
Absolutely. And so when you went out and you studied this for the book, what really seemed to be tactics that worked to be able to kind of like mobilize and invigorate millennials, especially unmarried ones, right, to invest in a religious institution?
Right. So I went across the country. I visited Muslim, Mormon, evangelical, Catholic, and Jewish institutions that I think were having a significant effect in this way. I think one of the most interesting ones is actually fairly intuitive. I spoke with a pastor at a black church in New Jersey, and he said that a few years ago he fired his wife. So what did he mean by this? His wife had been in charge of the women's ministry for something like 15 years. She had been doing a wonderful job, no doubt, but he had the sense that millennials, young adults who were coming to church, didn't feel as though they were needed. And so what he did was he said, look, you need to step aside and let somebody who's younger take over responsibility for this. What's happening is as we're living longer and healthier lives, more and more of us who are involved in religious institutions get territorial. We think, oh, I'm the best person at this particular area of ministry or volunteering, and we don't sort of move over and make room for young people to come. So I think the first thing is giving them more responsibility. I think that is a very important tactic. But, I would add another thing, too, which came up in a lot of my reporting. Millennials are really interested in a neighborhood. They're really interested in forming a local community. And in some ways, this is a little bit of a rejection of the megachurch model. I visited a neighborhood church, a Redeemer plant in New Orleans, which had decided that we're going to be the local church. The pastor walks everywhere. He sees people. If people come from another neighborhood in New Orleans, it's not that he rejects them, but he actually says to them, wouldn't you like to see if there's a church closer to you? Because we are going to minister to this particular neighborhood. This generation has one of the lowest rates of car ownership of any generation, and I think it's really interesting that they want to be able to walk to bars and coffee shops, but they also want to be able to walk to church.
I find your research really interesting because right now when you see denominational declines, which the Southern Baptist recently just posted theirs, a lot of the conversations that are being had are about about theology, right? And so every time this gap is announced, people go and then people will draw their conclusions about whether theology is pushing people out or theology is keeping people in, and often mainline and evangelicals battle over with each other about, different tenets that they hold that are kind of bringing people in or causing their churches to die. What you're suggesting, though, is that there's like actually logistical and demographic things that are going on in our country, whether it's marriage rates being later, or, you know, having a church that you can walk to, or a church that's in an urban environment, maybe behind some of this type of stuff.
Right. So I think those demographic trends we're talking about, the marriage thing is really, like I said, historically unprecedented, and it affects every single group. I mean, even the Mormons, who tend to get married much younger, their age of first marriage has been creeping up as well. So like I said, I think that affects everyone regardless of theology. I do think certainly, you know, the trends have been the more conservatively theological churches have experienced more growth in the last couple of decades, and the mainline churches have seen a much more significant fall off. That being said, I think that the trends that I talk about in my book, the practices that religious leaders and lay leaders can think about, really go across theology. They really are. I try to adopt a more sociological approach and say, look, what are the things that are driving young people away, and what are the things that are keeping young people in? And I think it's, you know, it's a really important way for people to look at it, because, you know, one reaction people often have to this decline is we need to spend a lot of money, we need to have very slick marketing campaigns.
Yep, exactly, yeah.
A huge amount of money and effort is devoted to these things, and oftentimes, I mean, I found in my research that technology was not the key. I mean, they you know, young people sort of expect, you know, a website that is updated. They expect a little bit of a Facebook post here or there, but that is not the thing that it seemed to me was keeping young people in.
You know, I did have a question with regards to the generation that's like below the millennials, though, and clearly they're growing up in a completely different relationship with technology. A lot of the sixth graders that I work with at my church, you know, have smartphones already, right? And so they've kind of always lived in this existence. And I wonder sometimes how the church is going to relate to those as it goes under like another change of reaching another generation, you know, that's comfortable with screens and all that stuff.
Right. I mean, I think that, you know, it's going to have to do some of that, but I'd encourage, you know, religious institutions and religious leaders to think about themselves as not always trying to exactly mimic the culture. You know, what I found in talking to millennials is that because their lives are so transient at this stage, you know, they're moving around, like I said, they're doing all these different things, churches often for them can provide a sense of permanence that they wouldn't otherwise have. So I worry about when we sort of say, like, how can churches and how can synagogues and how can mosques kind of keep up with the way these things are changing, when sometimes what these people or young people are looking for is something a little different.
Absolutely. Naomi, thank you so much for coming in today and just reminding us, I think, that technology can be a solution to some of this type of stuff, but it definitely kind of meets a confluence of factors in trying to bring people back to these religious institutions.
Thanks for having me.
For CP Newsroom, I'm Morgan Lee, and we'll see you next time.